Money collapses, empires crumble, currencies vanish into irrelevance. Throughout human history, civilizations have risen to unimaginable heights, only to watch their financial systems disintegrate in spectacular fashion. Rome, once the undisputed superpower of the ancient world, saw its currency debase into worthlessness. Weimar Germany experienced hyperinflation so severe that citizens used banknotes as wallpaper. Argentina, a nation that entered the 20th century as one of the wealthiest on earth, has endured multiple currency collapses, defaults, and economic catastrophes that wiped out generations of savings. Yet amid this chaos, amid the burning of wealth and the destruction of financial order, certain principles have remained constant. Certain truths about money, value, and survival have transcended every collapse, every hyperinflation, every currency crisis. These are not theories proposed by economists in ivory towers. These are battle-tested strategies that allowed families to preserve wealth when governments failed, that enabled merchants to continue trading when official money became worthless, that permitted communities to rebuild when institutional structures collapsed entirely. The pattern is unmistakable. Whether we examine the fall of Rome in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Weimar Republic's descent into monetary madness in the 1920s, or Argentina's repeated economic implosions throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the same financial principles emerge as lifeboats in the storm. Understanding these principles is not merely an academic exercise. It is essential knowledge for anyone who recognizes that financial stability is never permanent, that currencies are experiments in collective trust, and that the unthinkable can become reality with stunning speed. The first principle that has survived every collapse is perhaps the most fundamental. Hard assets outlast paper promises. This truth was understood by Roman citizens who watched their silver denarius, once containing nearly pure silver, gradually debased until it was merely bronze with a thin silver coating. Those who converted their savings into land, precious metals, and tangible goods preserved their wealth. Those who held currency saw it evaporate. In Weimar Germany, as the poppy mark plunged from 4.2 marks per dollar in 1914 to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar by November 1923, those who owned property, machinery, art, or gold maintained their economic position. Those who held cash or bonds denominated in marks were financially annihilated. The psychological mechanism behind this principle is rooted in the nature of value itself. Paper currency is nothing more than a promise, a collective agreement that a piece of printed paper represents a certain amount of purchasing power. This agreement is fragile. It depends on trust in institutions, confidence in government fiscal discipline, and belief in monetary stability. When that trust fractures, whether through endless money printing, war, political instability, or corruption, the paper itself becomes worthless. But a piece of land still grows crops. A gold coin still contains precious metal. A building still provides shelter. The tangible world does not disappear when governments fail. In Argentina, this principle has been demonstrated repeatedly. During the 1989 hyperinflation, when prices increased by 3,079% in a single year, those who held pesos saw their life savings destroyed in months. But those who had converted their wealth into real estate, vehicles, or even durable goods maintained their purchasing power. The pattern repeated in 2001 during the Corralito, when the government froze bank deposits and forcibly converted dollar accounts into devalued pesos. Physical assets, apartments in Buenos Aires, farmland in the Pampas, machinery, livestock, retained their value, while financial assets held in the banking system were confiscated through devaluation. The second principle that emerges across every collapse is equally powerful. Decentralization of resources provides resilience. In stable times, centralization appears efficient. It makes sense to hold money in banks, to rely on government systems, to concentrate resources in financial institutions. But when systems fail, centralization becomes catastrophic. The Roman collapse demonstrated this clearly. As central authority weakened and supply chains broke down, communities that had developed local self-sufficiency, their own food production, their own trade networks, their own skills, survived and even prospered. Those entirely dependent on the Roman system, particularly in cities reliant on imported grain, faced starvation and collapse. Weimar Germany showed this principle in urban versus rural dynamics. City dwellers, dependent on wages paid in rapidly worthless marks and on food purchased through official channels, suffered enormously.
Rural communities with direct access to food production, with the ability to barter goods and services outside the collapsing monetary system, weathered the storm far better. The same pattern emerged in Argentina, where those with diversified asset locations, some wealth abroad, some in local property, some in physical goods, could survive government confiscations and currency controls. Those with everything concentrated in Argentine banks or Argentine pesos lost everything. This principle extends beyond physical assets to knowledge, skills, and relationships. In every collapse, the ability to produce value outside the official economic system becomes essential. During Rome's decline, craftsmen with tangible skills, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, could always trade their work for food and shelter, even as the monetary economy disintegrated. In Weimar, those with professional skills, international connections, or the ability to operate in black markets survived, while pensioners and wage earners on fixed incomes starved. In Argentina, individuals with skills marketable internationally, with networks abroad, or with the knowledge to navigate informal economies maintained their standard of living while others were crushed. The third principle is perhaps the most psychologically difficult. Debt becomes either a weapon or a shackle depending on its nature. This is counterintuitive because conventional wisdom treats all debt as financially similar, but collapse teaches a brutal distinction. Debt denominated in a collapsing currency, particularly debt secured against real assets, can be extraordinarily advantageous. As currency devalues, debt evaporates. A mortgage on property taken out before hyperinflation becomes trivially easy to repay with devalued currency, effectively transferring wealth from lenders to borrowers. This happens systematically in Weimar, where those with property mortgages repaid them with worthless marks, acquiring real estate almost for free.
But the inverse is equally true and far more devastating. Debt denominated in hard currency or foreign money during a domestic collapse becomes an instrument of destruction. This principle destroyed countless Argentine businesses and families during the 2001 crisis. Companies that had borrowed in dollars, assuming the peso would remain stable or convertible, found themselves unable to service debts when the peso devalued by 75% virtually overnight. What had been manageable debt became unpayable obligation. Entire industries collapsed under the weight of dollar-denominated debt that quadrupled in real terms within months. The Roman experience with debt was more complex but equally instructive. As the currency debased, debtors initially benefited, repaying loans in increasingly worthless coins. But the collapse of the monetary system eventually made credit itself unavailable, creating a liquidity crisis that strangled commerce. Without reliable money and without trust in repayment, lending ceased. Economic activity dependent on credit, trade, construction, investment, ground to a halt. The lesson is sophisticated. Debt can be leveraged advantageously during controlled inflation or currency devaluation, but only if the debt is denominated in the weakening currency and secured against appreciating real assets. All other forms of debt, foreign currency debt, unsecured debt, or debt that cannot be serviced through productive assets, becomes catastrophic during collapse. The distinction matters enormously for practical decision-making. During the early stages of currency instability, taking on domestic currency debt to acquire hard assets can be extraordinarily profitable. Weimar investors who borrowed marks to buy real estate, factories, or gold made generational fortunes as their debts evaporated while their assets appreciated. But this strategy requires precise timing and carries enormous risk. Those who borrowed too late, after hyperinflation had accelerated beyond control, or who borrowed in foreign currency, or who held debt against assets that depreciated, were ruined. The principle is not debt is good or debt is bad. It is that the nature, denomination, and timing of debt determines whether it becomes a tool for wealth preservation or an instrument of destruction. The fourth principle that survives every collapse is the paramount importance of maintaining multiple currencies and stores of value. In stable times, this seems unnecessary. Why hold different currencies when one official currency serves all purposes? But collapse reveals the fragility of monetary monoculture. In Rome, as the official currency became unreliable, alternative forms of money emerged organically. Gold and silver coins from other regions circulated. Barter systems developed. Grain became a medium of exchange. Salt, from which we derive the word salary, functioned as money. Communities that could operate across multiple monetary systems maintained economic function. Those locked into the failing official currency faced economic paralysis. Weimar Germany demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. Germans with access to foreign currency, dollars, pounds, Swiss francs, could preserve their wealth completely. A single dollar, which exchanged for 4.2 marks in 1914, could purchase entire apartment buildings by 1923. Those with savings in foreign banks or foreign currency holdings maintained their purchasing power absolutely, while their neighbors who held only marks were annihilated financially. The wealthy and internationally connected protected themselves through currency diversification.
The middle class, trapped in mark-denominated savings accounts and government bonds, was destroyed as a social class. Argentina has provided a modern masterclass in this principle across multiple crisis cycles. During the 2001 Corralito, those who had moved money offshore, who held dollars and physical cash outside the banking system, or who maintained assets in foreign currencies survived the forced conversion and confiscation. Those who trusted the banking system and kept their savings in peso accounts lost most of their wealth overnight. The pattern repeated in subsequent devaluations and capital controls. Argentines learned, often through painful experience, that concentrating wealth in a single currency, particularly one controlled by a government with a history of monetary mismanagement, was financial suicide. But this principle extends beyond just holding multiple government currencies. The most successful wealth preservation strategies across collapses have involved diversification into fundamentally different types of value storage. Precious metals offer portability and universal recognition. Real estate provides productive use and shelter. Commodities like food and energy retain intrinsic utility. Foreign assets provide geographic diversification away from a single government's control. Skills and knowledge create value that cannot be confiscated. Social networks and relationships provide access to opportunities and information outside official channels. The pattern across all three collapses, Rome, Weimar, Argentina, shows that those who maintained this diversification, who never concentrated wealth entirely in official currency or official systems, retained the flexibility to adapt as circumstances changed. When one form of value was attacked or destroyed, they had others to fall back on. When capital controls prevented moving money, they had assets already positioned. When currency collapsed, they had alternatives readied. This wasn't paranoia or pessimism, it was rational response to historical reality. The fifth and perhaps most subtle principle is the critical importance of information asymmetry and early recognition of systemic instability. In every collapse, the destruction of wealth occurs unevenly across time. There are always early warning signs: fiscal imbalances, political instability, monetary expansion, trade deficits, social unrest. But the majority of the population, anchored by normalcy bias and trust in institutions, ignores these signals until far too late. Those who recognize instability early and act decisively preserve their wealth. Those who wait for official confirmation or widespread acknowledgement are destroyed. In Rome, the debasement of currency was not sudden. It occurred over decades and even centuries, accelerating during periods of military crisis and political instability. Sophisticated Romans who understood monetary policy, who recognized that emperors were systematically reducing silver content to finance wars and bribes, could adjust their behavior accordingly. They converted currency into real assets earlier, demanded payment in goods rather than coins, and positioned themselves to benefit from the changes. The masses, lacking this understanding or information, suffered the full brunt of purchasing power destruction. Weimar's hyperinflation similarly provided clear early warnings that most ignored. The money supply expanded dramatically after World War I. Government deficits spiraled out of control. Prices began rising in 1919, years before the final hyperinflationary collapse of 1923. Those with financial sophistication, access to information, and international connections began moving wealth abroad, converting to foreign currency, and buying hard assets in 1920 and 1921. They preserved their wealth completely. Those who trusted government assurances that the mark would stabilize, who believed official propaganda, or who simply lacked the information or sophistication to understand what was happening, held their marks until they became worthless. Argentina's repeated crises have shown this pattern so consistently it has become predictable. Government spending increases unsustainably. The central bank begins printing money to finance deficits. Inflation accelerates. The government insists everything is under control and that the currency peg or stability will hold. Capital controls are implemented to prevent money from leaving. And then the collapse occurs: devaluation, default, confiscation. Those who recognized these signs early and moved assets abroad, converted to dollars, or positioned themselves defensively survived. Those who believed government promises or waited too long lost everything.
The mechanism behind this principle is psychological as much as financial. Human beings are powerfully predisposed to believe that current conditions will continue indefinitely. This normalcy bias is adaptive in stable environments. Constant anxiety about collapse would be paralyzing and counterproductive. But during periods of genuine systemic instability, this bias becomes catastrophic. People convince themselves that it can't happen here, that their government is different, that modern economic tools make historical collapses impossible. They wait for definitive proof that never arrives until after the destruction has already occurred. The information asymmetry component is equally critical. In every collapse, those with access to privileged information, insider knowledge, or sophisticated analytical capabilities act first. Roman senators understood imperial finances and moved their wealth accordingly. Weimar industrialists with international connections recognized the trajectory and positioned themselves in foreign assets. Argentine elites with relationships in government and banking moved money offshore before capital controls were implemented. By the time the crisis became obvious to the general population, the opportunities for wealth preservation had largely closed. Capital controls were in place, asset prices had already adjusted. The exits were blocked. This creates a brutal but undeniable reality.
Financial survival during collapse is not evenly distributed. It correlates strongly with information access, analytical sophistication, and decisiveness. Those who study history, who understand economics, who pay attention to fiscal policy and monetary indicators, who maintain international awareness, and who are willing to act on their analysis despite social pressure to conform, these individuals and families preserve their wealth. Those who remain ignorant, who trust official narratives uncritically, who wait for consensus before acting, or who are constrained by inability to access information, suffer the full destruction. But there is a more egalitarian aspect to this principle. While privileged access to insider information provides advantages, the basic warning signs of systemic instability are visible to anyone willing to look. Government debt growing faster than GDP is observable. Money supply expansion is published data. Inflation accelerating beyond official targets is experienced directly. Political instability and social unrest are apparent. Trade imbalances and current account deficits are reported. The information exists. The challenge is psychological, overcoming normalcy bias, accepting uncomfortable realities, and acting with conviction before the crowd validates your concerns. The interconnection between these 5 principles reveals a comprehensive framework for understanding financial survival during collapse. Hard assets provide the foundation, tangible value that persists when paper promises fail. Decentralization creates resilience against single points of failure. Strategic use of debt can accelerate wealth preservation, but requires precise understanding of currency dynamics. Multiple stores of value provide flexibility and insurance against any single asset class being destroyed. And information advantage allows early positioning before opportunities close. These principles operate synergistically. Consider a sophisticated wealth preservation strategy that combines all 5 elements. An individual recognizes early warning signs of currency instability, government deficits accelerating, money supply expanding, inflation rising faster than official statistics admit. This is Principle 5, information advantage. Acting on this recognition, they take on domestic currency debt to purchase real estate and precious metals. This is Principle 3, strategic debt use, and Principle 1, hard assets. They position some assets internationally and maintain holdings in multiple currencies. This is Principle 4, diversification across monetary systems. They develop skills valuable across borders and cultivate relationships outside their home country. This is Principle 2, decentralization. When collapse arrives, this individual is comprehensively protected. Their domestic currency debt evaporates, effectively transferring wealth from the banking system to them. Their hard assets appreciate in real terms even as the currency collapses. Their international assets remain untouched by domestic capital controls. Their multiple currencies provide flexibility to operate in whichever monetary system proves most stable. Their skills and relationships create income opportunities independent of the collapsing domestic economy. They not only survive the collapse, they emerge positioned to acquire distressed assets from those who failed to prepare. The Roman patrician families who maintained their wealth through the empire's decline followed precisely this pattern. They held land across multiple provinces, reducing exposure to any single region's instability. They maintained gold and silver reserves independent of the official currency. They developed trade relationships across the Mediterranean, creating income streams outside the Roman monetary system. They cultivated skills and knowledge, literacy, legal expertise, agricultural management that retained value regardless of political circumstances. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, these families formed the foundation of medieval European aristocracy, their wealth preserved across centuries of chaos. The Weimar survivors, those who not only preserved but dramatically increased their wealth during hyperinflation, followed the same framework. They recognized the trajectory early, often as soon as 1919 or 1920. They borrowed marks aggressively to purchase factories, real estate, and foreign currency. They maintained assets in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States. They developed international business relationships. When the mark's collapse accelerated in 1923, they repaid their mark-denominated debts with worthless currency, while their hard assets had appreciated thousands of percent in real terms. Families like the Krupps, the Thysens, and other industrial dynasties emerged from Weimar hyperinflation with their economic power intact or even enhanced. Argentina's successful wealth preservers across its multiple crises have operated similarly. They maintain dollar accounts outside the Argentine banking system. They hold real estate both in Argentina and abroad. They develop export businesses that generate foreign currency income. They cultivate professional skills marketable internationally. They pay attention to fiscal policy and monetary indicators, recognizing instability before it becomes a crisis. When devaluations and confiscations occur, they are positioned on the right side of the wealth transfer, acquiring peso-denominated assets at fire sale prices with their preserved foreign currency holdings. The contrast with those who fail to apply these principles is stark and tragic. In Rome, urban populations entirely dependent on the imperial system starved when it collapsed. In Weimar, the middle class, civil servants, pensioners, wage earners with savings in mark-denominated bonds, was economically annihilated, their life savings destroyed in months. In Argentina, families who kept their life savings in peso bank accounts, who trusted government promises about currency stability, who had no foreign assets or foreign currency holdings, saw generations of accumulated wealth confiscated through devaluation and forced conversion. The emotional and social dimensions of these failures are as important as the financial mechanics. People resist these principles not primarily because they lack information, but because accepting them requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. It means accepting that governments fail, that institutions betray trust, that the social contract is fragile, that the future may be radically discontinuous with the present. It means taking personal responsibility for financial survival rather than trusting authorities. It means acting differently from one's peers, enduring social pressure and potential ridicule for overreacting or being paranoid.
This psychological resistance explains why the same patterns repeat across centuries and continents. Each generation believes itself exempt from historical forces. Each society convinces itself that modern institutions, technology, or economic understanding has made collapse impossible. The Romans believed their empire would last forever, that Roman law, Roman engineering, and Roman military power had created permanent stability. The Germans of the early 1920s believed that an advanced European nation could not experience catastrophic monetary collapse. Argentines in the 1990s believed that currency boards and dollarization had finally solved their inflation problems. In each case, the collective delusion persisted until reality destroyed it. Yet the principles themselves remain empirically valid regardless of belief. Physics does not require faith to operate, neither do these financial principles. Whether or not individuals accept them, whether societies acknowledge them or deny them, they continue to determine outcomes during collapse. Hard assets preserve value. Decentralized resources provide resilience. Strategic debt and depreciating currency transfers wealth. Multiple stores of value create flexibility. Early recognition and action separate survivors from victims. These are not opinions or theories. They are observable patterns replicated across every major financial collapse in recorded history. The implications for contemporary financial planning are profound and unsettling. The global financial system today operates on unprecedented levels of debt, monetary expansion, and interconnected complexity. Government debt across developed nations has reached levels previously associated only with major wars. Central banks have expanded money supplies by trillions. Asset prices have been inflated to historic valuations by artificially suppressed interest rates. The entire structure depends on continued confidence, continued credit expansion, and continued willingness of investors to accept negative real returns on government bonds. The warning signs that preceded Rome's monetary collapse, Weimar's hyperinflation, and Argentina's repeated crises are visible throughout the contemporary global economy. Fiscal deficits expanding unsustainably, monetary authorities explicitly committed to policies of currency devaluation through inflation, political polarization and institutional decay, growing wealth inequality and social unrest, trade imbalances and current account deficits, the acceleration of money supply growth dramatically outpacing economic output. These are not hypothetical risks, they are current realities. Applying the 5 principles to contemporary circumstances suggests specific, actionable strategies. First, the principle of hard assets over paper promises argues for allocation to real estate, precious metals, commodities, productive businesses, and other tangible stores of value rather than concentration in cash or bonds. This does not mean abandoning financial assets entirely. Liquidity and flexibility have value, but it means recognizing that currencies are political constructs subject to devaluation and that government promises to bondholders have been broken repeatedly throughout history. Second, the decentralization principle suggests geographic diversification, asset type diversification, and development of skills and relationships independent of any single system. This means holding assets in multiple jurisdictions, maintaining some wealth outside the traditional banking system, developing capabilities that create value across borders and economic systems, and cultivating relationships in different countries and industries. It means avoiding concentration risk, never allowing your entire economic life to depend on a single government, currency, or institutional system remaining stable. Third, the strategic debt principle requires sophisticated analysis of currency dynamics and risk tolerance. In an environment of sustained inflation and currency devaluation, fixed-rate debt denominated in depreciating currency to acquire appreciating real assets can be extraordinarily advantageous. But this strategy requires correct timing, selection of appropriate assets, and ability to serve debt even if conditions change. It also requires avoiding the catastrophic error of taking on foreign currency debt or debt that cannot be served from productive income. The Weimar fortunes were made by those who borrowed marks to buy real assets. The Argentine catastrophes occurred when companies borrowed dollars they could not repay. Fourth, the multiple currencies principle argues for maintaining wealth across different monetary systems and asset types. This means holding some allocation in foreign currencies, particularly those with stronger fiscal positions and more credible monetary authorities. It means maintaining precious metals as monetary insurance against currency collapse. It means holding real assets, property, businesses, commodities that retain value independent of any particular currency. It means potentially maintaining some wealth in emerging alternative monetary systems, whether cryptocurrencies or other innovations, recognizing their speculative nature, but also their potential as alternatives if traditional systems fail. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the information advantage principle demands continuous education, attention to fiscal and monetary indicators, study of history, and willingness to act on analysis even when consensus disagrees. This means understanding how government debt, monetary policy, inflation, and currency dynamics interact. It means studying historical collapses to recognize patterns.
It means paying attention to fiscal deficits, money supply growth, real inflation rates, political stability, and other systemic indicators. It means developing the psychological capacity to act on uncomfortable truths before the crowd validates your concerns. The challenge is that these principles, while historically validated, require accepting uncertainty and acting without guarantee of specific timing. Currencies can remain overvalued longer than rational analysis suggests. Governments can sustain unsustainable policies for years or even decades through various mechanisms. The gap between recognizing systemic instability and actual collapse can be substantial. Those who positioned for Weimar's collapse in 1919 were correct analytically, but early by several years. Those who recognized Argentina's instability in the 1990s were vindicated in 2001, but endured years of appearing wrong. This timing uncertainty creates real costs and psychological difficulty. Holding hard assets during periods when financial assets are appreciating means underperforming benchmarks. Maintaining geographic diversification and multiple currencies involves complexity and transaction costs. Taking strategic debt positions involves risk. Acting on early warning signs before consensus validation requires enduring social pressure and self-doubt. These are not trivial considerations. They explain why most people, even those intellectually aware of historical patterns, fail to position themselves appropriately. Yet the alternative, ignoring these principles and maintaining full exposure to systems that history shows will eventually fail, carries catastrophic risk. The question is not whether financial systems are currently stable. The question is whether they will remain stable throughout your lifetime and your children's lifetimes. History emphatically answers no. Every monetary system eventually fails. Every currency eventually loses its value. Every government eventually breaks its promises. The only questions are timing and magnitude. The 5 principles that survived Rome's collapse, Weimar's hyperinflation, and Argentina's repeated crises provide a framework not for predicting exactly when or how the next collapse will occur, but for positioning to survive whatever comes. They represent accumulated wisdom from thousands of years of financial catastrophe. They are lessons written in the destroyed savings of billions of people across centuries who trusted that this time is different, who believed their governments and institutions were exempt from historical forces, who concentrated their wealth in systems that proved tragic. The principles themselves are simple. Hard assets outlast paper promises. Decentralization provides resilience. Strategic debt can transfer wealth during currency collapse. Multiple stores of value create flexibility. Early recognition in action separates survivors from victims. The difficulty lies not in understanding these principles, but in applying them, in overcoming psychological resistance, in accepting uncomfortable truths, in acting with conviction before validation, in maintaining positions through periods of apparent error, and enduring the social and financial costs of being prepared for catastrophe that may not arrive for years or decades. But for those willing to learn from history, for those capable of recognizing that the present is not exempt from the forces that shape the past, for those who understand that financial stability is temporary and collapse is recurring, these 5 principles offer not certainty, but the best probability of wealth preservation when systems fail. They are the distilled wisdom of every family that survived when empires fell, of every fortune that persisted through hyperinflation, of every individual who emerged from crisis with their economic power intact. They are not guarantees, they are advantages, and in times of collapse, advantages mean survival.